The moderator for today's panel is Lauren Walsh. Lauren is a professor at New York University and director of the Gallatin Photojournalism Lab. She's the author of Conversations on Conflict Photography and Through the Lens, The Pandemic and Black Lives Matter. She's a co-author of Shadow of Memory on the Bosnian War and editor of Macondo, Memories of the Colombian Conflict. She's a leading expert on the visual coverage of conflict and crisis. Lauren also has an article in the upcoming spring issue of Zeke magazine on Picturing Atrocity, Ukraine Photojournalism and the Question of Evidence. And one of our presenters today, Svet Jacqueline, will also have a portfolio of her work in this issue of Zeke magazine. And for those of you not familiar with Zeke, it's a magazine published twice a year in print and digital by the Social Documentary Network. And if you'd like to read these articles and hold them in your hand, you can subscribe to Zeke at zekemagazine.com. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the SDN YouTube channel in a few days. So I'd now like to turn this over to Lauren.
Thank you. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Frank. Of course, thank you to the panelists, but thank you also to the audience for zooming in with us. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes, then I will introduce our panelists and we'll get the ball really rolling. Obviously, we've been hearing about the war in Ukraine for over a year. It dates back, of course, to 2014, but primarily, at least if you're based in the US, you've been hearing about it since February of 2022. Just recently, military analysts have declared that this is the largest conventional, and that term is important, it's the largest conventional military attack since World War II, full stop. A few other numbers. As of May last year, so almost a year ago, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees told us that 8.1 million refugees had fled Ukraine, another 8 million were displaced internally. As of November of last year, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff estimated around 100,000 Ukrainian troops had been killed or injured. And then as of February this year, so recent data, if we're thinking about kind of the other side of this conflict, the New York Times estimated that about 200,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded in this war, right? So the tolls are enormous, but I don't think you need to hear me say numbers to understand that. And what I would like to gesture toward is the fact that the work being done by the panelists tonight are why you already understand how horrific this conflict is. They played a large role in showing us what the conflict looks like, what kind of tolls it's taking, how the war is being waged, and in terms of keeping us engaged. So while I do think that statistics matter, I think that the journalists here tonight have played an enormous role in translating those statistics into comprehensible and compassionate reality. They've helped all of us understand better what's going on there. And I think tonight they can also speak to us about what it's like working on the ground when your job is to witness and document atrocities, essentially, and things that most of the rest of us will never see in person. So when we were organizing tonight's panel, we were asking ourselves some questions, and I thought I would just share these questions with the audience so you know what we were thinking about as we put this together. We said, how is photographing this war different from other wars? What conditions do photographers endure to inform us? And what we really had in mind was the breakneck speed of today's kind of news cycle. Does this work change the lives for the millions who are suffering? What difficulties do photographers face on the ground? And kind of very simply, why do this work? So we're going to hear about this and much more. Those are some of the questions we came up with. And I encourage everyone who's in the audience, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat. We're going to listen to the panelists first, but there is time saved to go over your questions and to put them to the panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to read short bios for each of you, and then we'll get it going. Nicole Tung is a freelance photojournalist. After covering the conflicts in Libya and Syria, she spent 2014 documenting the lives of Native American war veterans in the US, as well as former child soldiers in the DR Congo, the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, and the refugee crisis in Europe. She has received multiple awards for her work from the International Photo Awards, Society of Professional Journalists, PX3, and was named PDN's 30 Under 30 Emerging Photographers in 2013, among other titles and awards. Tung received the 2018 James Foley Award for Conflict Reporting from the Online News Association, and her work has been exhibited widely. Evgeniy Maloletka is a Ukrainian conflict photographer, journalist, and filmmaker who has been covering the war in Ukraine since 2014. He has also covered the Euromaidan Revolution and the protests in Belarus, among other crises. In February and March of 2022, Maloletka, along with Associated Press visual journalist Mstislav Chernov, stayed in Mariupol, which was encircled by Russian troops and extensively bombed. They were among just a very, very tiny number of journalists working for international outlets who stayed there during that period. And thus, they were among the very few who were able to communicate the horrors in Mariupol to an outside world. Maloletka's March 9, 2022 photo of medics carrying a bloodied pregnant woman ran on the front page of every major American newspaper the day after it was taken. His work during the siege of Mariupol has been recognized with multiple awards, including the Knight International Journalism Award, the Visa d'Or News Award, and the Prix Bayeux Calvados Normandie. And just this week, he received an award from the World Press Photo. Svet Jacqueline is a graduate of the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Her book, 100 Days of Protest, explores the Black Lives Matter movement. She focuses on social justice issues such as migration and poverty, and has won first place in the International Photography Awards and the MPPA Best of Photojournalism. When Russia invaded Ukraine, she began focusing on visual stories around childhood trauma in conflict zones. She's a member of Women Photojournalists of Washington, the National Press Photographers Association, and is currently represented by Zuma. I should say, they all have much more extensive bios. I cut them down in the interest of time, but they are extremely accomplished, well beyond what I even just read. But I think it's important to just let them speak for themselves and to listen to them talk about their work. So I think we're going to go in the order of Nicole, Evgeniy, Svet. So Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're going to show us your work, talk about your work, and then we'll go from there. You are muted.
Great, thank you for that introduction. And thanks everybody for joining, and for SDN and Photo and Frank for organizing all of this. So yeah, so I've been working in conflict zones since 2011. And I think, you know, the first sort of instance when I got into Ukraine was 4 days after the start of the war. And I took a train from Warsaw into Kyiv. And it was an overnight train that I was lucky enough to get on. There were very few people on there, save for a few dozen people, men, who were going back into the country to fight. I'd never been to Ukraine, never worked in this part of the world. Most of what I'd done has been in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia over the past 12 years. And so kind of going into what essentially is a full-blown war without understanding the language and necessarily the context that you're working in, you know, there's like a very steep learning curve. And I had a lot, you know, to owe to the people around me who were generous enough to try and translate things and try and help me understand the situation. And it was a very confusing situation because I went to Kyiv straight away, and, you know, of course, right after the start of the war, everything had closed down other than a few grocery shops. The streets were completely empty. The atmosphere was extremely tense, and people didn't, you know, people were very afraid. So when you go into that environment and you're trying to figure out people's body language and people's sort of behavior in this situation, it took me a while to try and be able to even photograph, really, and to feel comfortable photographing, because you didn't know how close to get to people and how, you know, how to even really communicate. So, you know, normally when I go into a conflict zone or when something starts, especially places like Syria, I was going in illegally and crossing borders, you know, running across all olive fields and under fences. And this was a very different approach because I had time to think about what I was going to potentially encounter. And over the next couple of weeks, I stayed in Kyiv, as did many other journalists, kind of just trying to figure out really the situation and understanding how to move around and understanding how to photograph and understanding what was at stake. And of course, one of the suburbs of Kyiv was Irpin, and further on a little bit is Bucha. And so when I got in there, you know, the first couple of weeks was really just looking at the movement of people, which was obviously the biggest movement of people since the Second World War. And in Irpin one day, this was, I think probably, this was March of 2022. As far as the eye could see, because, you know, the train station went further out of this frame, was just women and children. And it was just shocking to kind of, you know, of all the conflict and trauma that you kind of witness in covering wars over a period of time, seeing the fear on people's face and also hearing the sound. And what pictures don't capture, obviously, is the sound, was that the shelling was drawing closer and closer to the train station. And at this point, people could still flee by train to go to Kyiv and then further on west of Ukraine or into Poland. So really just like, you know, these initial moments of like the war really drawing closer to people's homes and their lives changing within an instant. It's so hard to capture because, you know, one photo can't tell it all, but yeah, I think, you know, even just trying to understand how that must feel to then be able to bring that kind of empathy into a picture was a challenge to begin with. And then, you know, as the kind of weeks wore on, I was still in Kyiv at this time, and I was photographing for Harper's Magazine initially. I'll explain a little bit why I chose black and white, but you know, we were doing things around Kyiv, how people's lives were being transformed. Every inch of space was becoming kind of on a war footing. This was a maternity hospital where all the patients had been moved underground, as did many other hospitals and places. And this was Anna, who was about to give birth. She was in labor, holding her husband Yuri's hand as he was counting the time between her contractions. You know, this was such a elemental human moment, mixed in with all of the uncertainty and fear in her face, you know. And she turned to me and she was like, I'm not supposed to be here. Why am I, you know, underground giving birth, and I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going on. So like that kind of moment of like utter confusion, but and true fear, because, you know, she was about to bring a life into this world. Yeah, and I just like happened to, there was some press tour going on into this hospital, and like, but it being able to move away from that just for a split second to photograph something intimate, you know, I felt that that was really, really strong too, and that they allowed me to be there in that moment too. This was a soldier who was burying his father, who was also killed in fighting. You know, nobody, just really bare. This is at the crematorium in Kyiv. Bare surroundings. There was nobody else there. He was dressed in full uniform and just very simply saying goodbye to his father, who was killed in the fighting somewhere near Kyiv. And a priest, you know, I mean, like there were so many I think there's so many things that happen in this war that just don't go, that go unseen, simply because there's always so much happening at any given moment. This was like, yeah, on the Irpin bridge. Nobody knows how this man died or why he was up there on a bicycle. But down below this, out of the frame, obviously, were thousands and thousands of people trying to evacuate from Irpin towards Kyiv on a daily basis in March. when Bucha and what looked like Irpin was going to be taken over, and was taken over. So, you know, there was just this like very, again, stark moment of like one man getting a stretcher to go and pick up this person, this body. And so many things that go, so many questions that go unanswered, like how did he die, how did he get up there? And you know, it was likely that he was killed by shelling, but you know, we kind of searched around for evidence of shelling and didn't find any, but yeah, and I hope that he was sort of identified in the end. This was down in Odessa in April. This was a constant thing, like between sort of at the end of April to May and June, every single day, there was just dozens and dozens of funerals happening around the country. And that was, you could just tell that it was a sign of how things were going on the front lines. You know, this was a mother cradling her son, and before they went to the cemetery to bury him. You know, I think one of the really difficult things about photographing funerals, and especially photographing so many funerals, is I don't understand the language, and I think in a way that kind of shields me from a lot of the trauma, but feeling the pain of people, you know, saying goodbye in such an abrupt way when they know that this whole entire war could have been averted or avoided or just not started in the first place. You know, there's so little reasoning to be had, is truly heartbreaking. And finally, this was in Kharkiv. So this series was for Harper's. It was done in black and white, and it was more of a, I think, aesthetic choice in the beginning because it was my first time, obviously, working in an environment like this in Ukraine, and I felt that, you know, there was some sort of, there was so much going on and so many different, I think, ways of telling the stories, as many photographers have, that for me, this was just the most sort of boiled down to like the elemental elements of the pictures. And I wanted to maintain the focus on that. So this final picture in the series of the black and white was taken in Kharkiv. And as we've all seen the pictures of sandbags, you know, being used to cover up precious statues and works of art, this was also the case of these workers that were covering up the Independence Monument. And to me, there was just a lot of, I guess, allegorical ways that you can look at this picture too, because, you know, it was like Ukraine's independence and celebrating Ukraine's independence, and that it just was being covered up because its independence was being under attack. Switching to color here, this was like, the next few pictures are all from my assignments with the New York Times in Ukraine. I've been going back a few times over the past year, and, you know, seeing how the war has sort of progressed and changed and back and forth, changing hands, places, you know, you start to realize that, like, in every conflict situation, people adapt to a new way of living, and how, like, at first the situation is kind of like shock and people either deny or flee or try to, you know, make sense of it. And when that becomes not an option and the people who stay behind, they deal with the situation. This was in Svet Jacqueline, where there's a very important monastery, but this is one of the churches in the city. And lots of people had stayed behind and sheltered in this one particular church or monastery. And, you know, I think when this was also during the period of the counteroffensives by the Ukrainians. So they were the Ukrainian military was retaking a lot of territory that had initially been occupied by Russian forces. And, you know, the initial kind of reaction of people when you go in there is of fear and worry that the Russian forces might come back, or that there's going to be retribution against them. But also just seeing that damage and how people kind of fit into that context and relate to it in a way is really incredibly sad, but also incredible at the same time, because they, have seen all this destruction, they lived through it, and then they still try and go about their daily lives. These women who were there were trying to cook outside. Kind of just, do you want me to answer? Are there questions in the chat? 1 second.
I'll monitor the chat for you.
Oh, okay. So I'm not going to look at the questions, or?
Don't worry.
Okay. Yeah. So, continuing on, it was like what I was saying about spaces being transformed in Ukraine. It's, I think sometimes you get really focused as a photographer of like, well, here are the people, and this is what I need to photograph. But, looking at very small villages, no one has been left untouched. No place has been left untouched. Everything, no matter how far away from the front line it is, has experienced the conflict in one way or another. And, when you go to these villages, you stumble upon just like a real community of people. It's not a big city. Everybody knows everybody. And the kind of heartbreak and the loss is just so much more palpable and present. These are civilians who are fleeing from areas near Kupiansk. This is also during the counteroffensive, when the Ukrainian forces military was retaking areas in the east. And there was this very familiar pattern where they would retake the towns, and then, the Russian forces would then start shelling these retaken places. But the trauma is just so kind of like visible on people.
Nicole, we have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the time now. Okay.
Right.
This was a field hospital where soldiers and civilians were being treated side by side. This is in the Zaporizhia region. Kind of like the rhythm of war becomes very familiar as well. And the same with like missile strikes that are happening in cities and towns that are so far from the front line. So it's like, yeah, there is a very delineated front line in Ukraine, but at the same time, you just never know where something's going to happen, even if you are seemingly far away from it. And this particular picture is of a suspected spy, a Russian spy, who was caught on the front line near Liman before Liman was retaken by Ukrainian forces. And he was being accused of spying for the Russian forces, and there was just this like really rare moment in I think in this situation where you get to photograph this happening, this process of a prisoner of war being taken. And finally, yeah, we kind of, one of the things that I really wanted to touch on here was like how enormous the scale of potential war crimes and war crimes are in Ukraine. But what is so phenomenal about this process in Ukraine is that it's happening as the war is still continuing. And I've never seen that in a conflict before, because anytime you found bodies or mass graves, they were just sort of left there, or personal effects would be taken and then the bodies would be reburied. This is a very, very different process where you kind of like see, there's like a bunch, yeah, this process taking place. There was a body found near Bucha, and the family, they identified him, they called in the family, and the family, then goes and identifies, or they were buried because they were killed in shelling. This is also considered a war crimes case. So many kind of things that go on in the background that I don't think, make it necessarily all the time into the bigger kind of louder newsy stories. And yeah, we're running out of time, but that's
excellent. Thank you, Nicole. And You got a whole lot of compliments in the chat and a few questions that I'll come back to at the end. And even just to the point that you were just making about the war crimes, that happens to be the topic of my article that will be in Zeek magazine. And you're 100% correct. This is the first war where investigators are acting on suspected war crimes within weeks or days of the alleged crime itself. That has never happened before in history. I also just wanted to say thank you to you and to the upcoming speakers, not only for bringing us a little closer to the stories behind what we're looking at, but to giving us this understanding, like when you said, the reminder to all of us that we may not hear the audio of a grieving mother, but you are right there experiencing that grief. And I think it's easy for us to forget about what the photographer endures because we just look at the images. Evgeniy, I'm gonna turn it over to you. I think Glenn is gonna run your images and you'll be speaking about them.
I'm Glenn. Hi all. Yeah, again, thank you so much. Glenn, I may ask you to turn on this Mariupol, I think, folder, and then, like others, so that will be easier.
Okay, sure. All right,
To
one
start the conversation. So.
All right, and these are just going to run in the order that they're in
Yeah,
my Finder.
I think that's like. So, great, thank you. Yeah, so like for all of us, the Ukrainians, the war started like not on the 24th of February. It started like 9 years ago. So it was not the first time when we saw that when our people are in these kind of conditions and it's like under the shelling, get losses of their loved ones. But when this full-scale invasion came in, we were in Mariupol, and we understood that people did not believe that it is happening, and they don't want to understand that that will be not the same as 9 years ago. So maybe it will the armed forces will stop this and somehow they can live a normal life as before, like they can wait a couple of days, it will be finished and everything will be fine. But not this time. We saw that from the first days, like massive attacks on firstly on they targeted military areas, but at the same day they become targeted civilian neighborhoods by MLRS, grads, and on the first days we saw like the first kids coming to the hospitals. The doctors trying to resuscitate the child, and but unfortunately they lost it. And we saw how the doctors were crying. These young felchers in the ambulance were, like they saw maybe the first time when they saw how the kid, passed away, and they couldn't did anything, they couldn't done anything. The doctors screaming, show this to Putin, this cry, this cries of the crying doctors. And next days it still continue, and another father bring his son and two his other friends to the hospital. And it's, what shocked me and was I didn't understand why it's happening to us. Is it like real or it's a dream? Can I wake up? But not, it's like, and the shelling on, outside of the hospital becoming louder and louder. And we didn't sometimes didn't understand, like, what should we do? Should we leave or should we stay more? And when we understood that so many people here in Mariupol, we definitely might to stay as long as possible and to show them what will happen to them. And if the corridor will open, we might to stay, to live with them. So we stayed in Mariupol for 20 days and trying to photograph as much as possible. And sometimes I couldn't turn on the camera in time, and sometimes I just showed the parents the way how to enter the hospital, because the door was another door where they came was closed, and I trying to show the way how to enter, and maybe they will have a time to save their kid. So, but unfortunately, many we saw too many deaths of kids, and these civilians as well were injured and been in a hospital on these last days before the Russian came. We were in one day we were stuck in a hospital, and we saw from the window when the Russians started rolling on their tanks, and we saw this sign of war, not from the pictures, from your Telegram channels or others. And then they start shooting to the buildings. One time, second time, third time. At that specific picture, they killed two women who were unable to go to the shelter. And after that, we saw the neighbors of them that they showed the two burned bodies they graved just in front of their house. Or this Anastasia Yarshova was lost her kid and the brother's kid while her house were attacked by a military jet, and the house was completely destroyed. Likely they were able to get out from the debris, and they was sitting and crying in a hospital, totally shocked. This famous image of Irina Kalinina, 32. Later I spoke to her husband, and he told me a story how he was looking for her body in dozens of people, dead bodies, different morgues. And likely he found her and buried her on the cemetery with her neighbors. And then her body was replaced to her parents to another village. And now he is safe, he is out from Mariupol and live in UK. But unfortunately, he lost her loved one, lost everything, his house, her wife. And this is a crater, how was bombed this maternity ward, We were able to be not super fast, but mostly in time, that we show some part of evacuation process from the maternity ward. 3 people were killed, and it was a big attack on us after this material, that everything was photoshopped, or there was many versions of our material, when we publish it, they're trying to attack us on social media, from TV channels, and blaming us as informational terrorists. So like it's they still use like my name like as and telling me that I'm a propagandist. So and they destroyed the old infrastructure as well as a firefighter brigade, and no one can like stop the fire in the city. So it's was every day in Mariupol was harder and harder. We were stopped many times by just regular people. They are asking us of any source of information because it was a blockade and no one can tell them anything. Is it Kiev is taken or Kharkiv is taken? And I said, no, it's like it's Kiev is, you know, like fighting, you know, and Kharkiv is fighting, you know, and unfortunately Kherson is taking, but tell them the security situation. Do you know that what's going on in the nearest village to the Mariupol? We don't know. It's like we are in blockade. We don't like actually. We just know general things, but the information so shocked people, and they start looting shops. They start, you know, like even there was food, but there was some kind of spread. What was Russian did, they spread in fear, and then the people don't understand what to do. They become in panic. So it was really as well a hard thing when we were with funeral workers who are taking bodies from the hospital and bring this to the mass graves. And then another vehicle came and bring another bodies. And the third vehicle came and bring another like part of the bodies, and they put them in a trench. And these 30 meters long. Like every day it's more and more. So people are coming here. So
You want me to start with the larger body of work? Got some time.
I think I will finish for Mariupol. So like we're like after like we were able to get out from Mariupol after through 16 or 15 Russian checkpoints. Like the road for 150 kilometers through the occupied areas take us mostly whole day to drive, and in the night we're like cross, you know, the contact line, and like we're like so happy to get out, you know. And unfortunately when we next day we understood that drama theater was bombed, and there was so many people were there, and we were like, why we didn't stay for another day, why we missed it, you know, like. And all the time you try to analyze, or maybe we should stay for a 1 day longer, maybe that's would be, people will see more war crimes and the war will like react more. I think it's was really hard to understand, you know, like why it's still going on, why the world is just looking on that, and it's still after 1 year of the war. I feel like did we done a lot, or should we done more, and how we should do more to make people react to political, to react more, to make this war stop, and you know, and what we should show, how we should risk our lives to show that to the people, like even to Jewish who show this every day. Unfortunately, the war will continue. understood why. Because all our pictures, videos are interpreting from the other side. They say this is a lie, this is fake, or other things, but it will continue for a long time, as I understood. And unfortunately, what we should do is like still continue to photograph, still continue to report. I don't know like how to do more, but it's still like every day like to do this. I think we can continue to the other folder. So I think it's will be.
Okay, I'm gonna just jump in before we move to Svet. Evgeny, thank you. I know you said you asked yourself.
It's fine. Like we have more time, but I think like
we have a little time. I think I have to move on to Svet, but I mean, just to your question of have we done enough? I can imagine many journalists in your position asking that question. And I do think that what you were doing even here tonight is very, very important, talking to us about what's going on. I also just wanted to note that I think a lot of times, particularly people who have never been in a conflict setting, look at some of these pictures and feel very upset or very helpless in response. And there is sometimes a reaction to get angry at the photographer, like, how dare you take this picture? Why didn't you go and help that person? And I think it's so important that you told us that there are times that you didn't get the photo because you were helping the parents find their entrance into the hospital. So thank you. Svet, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Jenny, do you feel like you were able to present everything you wanted to?
There was like other like many stories, like it just was only one part from Mariupol, you know, but we were like continuing, like after Mariupol, we were like continuing to work. We've been in other many places, photographing, like other like journalists as well, but we were able sometimes like to document, you know, like as well. You know, aftermath, you know, sometimes it was really strong images, sometimes it was less, but still what we are trying to do, you know, like it's to collect sometimes historical evidences, because on the war, everything goes fast. You know, sometimes, you know, like even in Chernihiv, I remember myself when I come, the people so loved their city, and they become, you know, organize themselves in a groups to clean the streets, to clear the rubble together. When you come in like in 1 week, you're not like, it looks like, oh, is it was like this house was repaired or like just, you know, like not bombed, or the streets are clean. It looks strange, you know, like, and sometimes you need to be very, very fast to document what's going on, you know, to be just after, because the time of the situations is go very, very fast, you know, and you need to document the emotions of people, how they pass these experience, you know, and why they did this choice to stay, or, and this is sometimes, and it's really important, you know, like to communicate to these people, to communicate to the relatives. And I've been like photographs, you know, like of how Ukrainian servicemen trying to find their comrades who fell in the battlefield, and they collecting the bodies. And I took these pictures, how the soldier found his comrade with whom he was fighting during this counteroffensive. And I published image, like in a week or like 2 weeks, the mother of a soldier who was died, like wrote me, and trying to send more pictures, because she received a body in a closed coffin and she wanna look how her son looks like and what is the place and how it was there. And she told me a story that the guy who was on the photograph died 3 days after.
Svet, why don't we move on and look at your photos now, and then we could continue discussion afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I asked this because I think that we have a really interesting pairing of 3 photographers who are coming from very different backgrounds in covering this. And Evgeniy, this is your community, you're representing, the most affected. And then Nicole, you said this was your first time in Ukraine. It was also my first time there, but my first 2 years were spent in an orphanage in Russia. And for me, where I come from really motivates the types of stories that I try to tell. And when I arrived in Ukraine, it was so apparent to me that the displacement of women and children, similar to what you were talking about, Nicole, was sort of this underlying story of this conflict, because the impact of this war will stay with children the longest. It will completely carve their lives in the way that they see the world before they really understand what the world is. So the work that I'm presenting today is really focused on the childhood experience. And I will share my screen one moment. But I really want to thank Frank and Glenn for having me. And I'm definitely, a younger photojournalist approaching conflict coverage. And for me to be surrounded by such inspirational photographers like Nicole and Jenny has allowed me to find a voice in this war and hopefully do justice to the stories that I'm sharing. Does everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay. So the aftermath of this war is really still developing. There's still a lot of displacement happening across the border of Poland and Ukraine, and I arrived through Poland. So my first exposure was to a mass exodus of refugees, and specifically young refugees. So I tried to capture what it was like to be a child moved from your home very abruptly, and better understand how they're assimilating over time. And for me, this is the very beginning of a deep dive into the long-term impacts of this war. I spent 7 months in Ukraine last year, but I see myself spending maybe years there, visually telling the experience of children as this war continues and as they age into the reality of living in a conflict zone. As they get older, many of these children will be drafted into the war as young adults. Some will help raise the families that their parents died to protect. And, some of them will never return home to their cities again. And their voices are lost in a conversation about conflict and about politics of this war. I hope that though the images that we see are very much about the casualties, we recognize that there's still such a life that's happening in Ukraine and a daily life that is developing around this conflict, not just from a day-to-day perspective, but as we are adjusting to what it means of Ukraine and Russia to be living through this war. And for children, they are not in school. They are not in dance classes. They are not interacting with their peers. They are simply isolated in the darkest corners of a country that they just desperately want to feel is home again. And so I spent time with these children. For example, this is Victoria. She's 6 years old. She is living in Saltivka, which is at the time, at the end of March, it was about 5 kilometers, maybe almost 10 from the front lines. And for 2 months, she's had an hour a day outside, where even then it's a risk. You know, they're not sure whether there will be an attack, but just a few minutes a day to get some fresh air. And then her entire day is spent in a bunker. And every night, all you can hear are rockets. And that is her childhood. And, you know, it really makes you question your own privilege as somebody who got something so small as days of peace and days of joy. Where do children find that in Ukraine today? And when you're exposed to so much trauma and you're seeing such adult, horrible things happen, I try to find moments of joy from the perspective of children who are still playing and laughing in the face of this evil. And what will that look like as time goes on? And who will they become as people? Where will their interests lie as children who are stripped of their childhood? I know I'm going a little fast. I'm just trying to keep it on the time line, but you can see a full extension of the work. I am going back to continue these projects. I'm re-meeting with these families. This family that lives in Lviv. This is Emily. She is visiting her father, who just came back from the front lines in Kherson. He was injured by an anti-tank mine and lost both his legs and 2 fingers on his left hand. And he is now in a stage of recovery, trying to reestablish a parental role in her life. But in fact, she is the one taking care of him. And, you know, her experience is affected by this war. And so many children are experiencing the same reality. And I ask, you know, as we start to look away from the news and turn down the radio, because we've heard so much about Ukraine, that we recognize that this conflict will follow all of us. You know, this is a fight for democracy for all people. And I think the stories are most genuinely and I guess authentically reflected through the eyes of children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Svet. And I think I liked very much the point that you made, much better than I, the moderator, when you recognize that there's a triangulation of perspectives here and what the 3 photographers are working on, and how this gives us a much deeper, more dimensional understanding of what's happening. And yes, exactly to your point, you know this already, but even when the militaries, even when the fighting stops, the fighting proper, this war will have impacts that will last generations. And I think that work is incredibly important. I would love to open it up to questions. I know that some were dropped into the chat, and Nicole was fielding a few that were directly pointed to her. I saw one that came up while Evgeniy was speaking. The question was essentially, I'm going to kind of paraphrase it a little bit, but I think it was, how do you do this emotionally? Like at the end of each day, how do you process what's happening? Do you get breaks from this work? Does it stay with you? So I'll start that as a first question, and that's probably a question that can actually get pitched to all of the panelists. Evgeniy, if you want to go first.
I think here, like as a Ukrainian, you cannot like 100% to switch off. You're always in news, always trying to identify what's going on, like in every single attack. Trying, is it big or small? Is it targeted something? You know, like looking for from the colleagues, from the friends, what's going on. And even you not on assignment, you're doing this all the time. So it's definitely, I can tell that all the people in Ukraine are traumatized. You know, we are not unique. We are like human, but I can say that as a journalist, we have a privilege to tell the stories, and we have a mission to do that. Like soldiers or like doctors, they know what they are doing, you know, and probably this is how to prevent the trauma in an early period. Maybe it will not, I think will just prolong this period, you know, it's not that will make it passed away definitely, so it will stay with us for a long time. But I hope that I think the recovery period, you know, will be later, you know, but after a year, I can tell you that it's tough. It's tough to look all of that, to read every day is unsuccessful news. It's not easy. So, but as I told you before, we have a mission and we should continue to do that. Can't hear you.
Thank you. I was just saying, Svet or Nicole, did you want to add any thoughts to that, particularly from the vantage of, I'm not Ukrainian, this isn't my community, but nevertheless, I'm witnessing and documenting extremely heavy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add much more to what Jenya's just said because, the Ukrainian journalists are living through it 24/7. I leave and I go work on other stories and, but at the same time, it is even from afar, it is very hard to switch off because I think there's always so much going on there, and trying to stay on top of it and staying informed is what we do. But I think as someone who's not Ukrainian, I can't say it's easier to create distance. It's definitely not, because the things that you see don't leave you. But I have the luxury of leaving the country, whereas many other Ukrainian journalists don't. Yeah.
And I also think that this is a testament to the Ukrainian people. I think that who they are through their resilience through this conflict, but also just from interactions that I'm sure every journalist has had personally, makes you invested, and it makes it really, really challenging to turn an eye or ever turn off the conflict that's happening there. I think it's one of those places that has a heart that makes it feel like home, even if you are a foreign journalist.
Another question that I had that Nicole, you were going to get to, and then I think I stole the mic from you. But you were saying, I'm going to address why I did the Harper's work in black and white and then New York Times work in color. And of course, Svet, yours is a kind of long-term body that looks to be all in black and white. And Evgeniy, you're working for a wire and all the images are in color. So Nicole, I'll just start with you if you could talk to us about the decision to work black and white versus color.
Yeah, look, I try really hard to not just focus on like the black and white versus color, because I think ultimately the photos themselves have to have the message and the power and the content and the context to for people who are looking at the images to grasp all of that in one picture, in a single image. You know, yeah, it's an aesthetic choice, but ultimately for me, if the pictures tell the story in black and white or color doesn't really make a difference to me. It's really about like, you're a photographer, you're in that moment, are you being empathetic and making sure that people are coming across as dignified even in the most difficult, sensitive, darkest moments. You know, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about the aesthetic choices necessarily until maybe later, or I go into like photographing for a magazine versus photographing for a newspaper. You obviously have to have certain ways of doing things. But to me, the most important thing is, are you being respectful to the story and to the people?
Svet, did you want to add anything since you have made the decision to do yours in black and white?
For the most part, you know, I completely agree. I think it is a photographer's decision, and it is a subject-driven decision. You know, for me, I come from a history that was deeply intertwined with the Holocaust. I grew up seeing black and white images of genocide. And when I arrived in Ukraine, those memories were triggered. Those like timeless historical moments were really elicited. And I think that I started seeing these moments very much in black and white from the beginning. And that was also a personal choice.
There's another question in the chat about whether any of you have worked with fixers. And I saw that there was a question in the chat earlier. Nicole, you fielded it, a question about how do you get military access? And the answer, of course, you have to be accredited. But if anyone wants to speak to their experience of possibly working with a fixer or also known as a local producer, maybe even an explanation of, in case there's someone in the audience who doesn't fully understand, what is the local producer, what do they do, and how is that relationship? What is it like?
I can tell so as well. Even us, like sometimes we're trying to work ourselves, but as well, it's really good to work with the producers. It's really help to organize events, to organize a meeting, to communicate with the editors. It's become your life a bit easier. And as well, when you're working in the field, and when everything go fast, you need to add your details very, very sharp and without mistakes. To write the names of the persons, contacts, etc. When you, like, for example, took the picture already or like interviewed the person, it's good to have like all contacts. You can like switch to other direction, start to do something else, while the fixer, like producer, will finalize, you know, the conversation, you know, and to get all the details what will be needed for additional information. So it's really helpful, you know, in the field. And as well, like, for example, when you drive in a car, like it's good to have extra person who can drive as well while you are trying to photograph, shoot videos or whatever. So in case something happened as well, like you have like a person who you trust. So it's really good to have not just a fixer translator, but as well person whom you trust, especially when you are working in a war zone. It's sometimes it's must, it's not like it's really important. Basic knowledge of paramedicine, and it's good. So.
And Svet or Nicole, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, especially for people who don't speak Ukrainian or Russian for that matter, it's essential to the work we do. I mean, we call them fixers, but there's so much more than that. I mean, they're a whole basically unit office person working in the field with you at all times, who is setting up the meetings and the contacts and translating and interpreting, and listening to conversations to hear what's going on and pointing me in directions that I would not have caught on to. Like, I depend so much on this one person. They are working, as hard as I am, if not harder than me, often, so it's very essential to the work that especially foreign journalists do in Ukraine. And they, I think we have to be very empathetic to their situations too, because, for example, the local producer I work with is from Kramatorsk in East Ukraine. And, she hasn't really been able to go home. And she's also living through the situation of the war, and also under a lot of pressure to work and help produce the stories that we do. So it's just like so many layers of, I suppose, exhaustion as well. And so it is very, we owe a lot of the news that has come out into the world to the local producers that have helped us to produce it.
I think for the final question, because we just have a few minutes, so I guess I'll ask for brief responses. But for all of the work that the three of you are doing, as well as many of your colleagues, I wonder if there are spaces or topics that you think we are not seeing, right? Things that are occurring but are not reaching our eyes, spaces where you don't have access or it's just too dangerous. What aren't we seeing?
I mean, of course, we're not seeing what's happening in Russia. There is currently a large migration of Ukrainians through Russian territory that is very hard to report on. There was just a Wall Street Journal reporter who was taken captive for attempting to report on what's happening in Russia. But I think that there's not necessarily another side to what we're seeing, but there's a lot happening that we aren't seeing. We're really only seeing what we're able to access. If anyone else wants to build on that.
Well, I'd just like to add that I've seen a lot of Evgeny's photographs that we didn't see today. And, some of them are the real graphic side of war that were often spared in the media, but really shows us, what is happening to people's bodies on the battlefield.
I mean, Glenn, maybe I'll kind of wind us down there because we are pretty much at time. I know that this conversation could go much longer, and there's a lot of, like Glenn, you were just saying, we didn't even touch the topic yet of graphic imagery and how audiences respond and what decisions editors make about how to use or move or hold those images, and that's a conversation unto itself. I'll leave that one to the side for now. It is, for at least two of our panelists, very, very late at night, so I think they are time zones away and have stayed up to be here and talk to us about their work. I want to thank Glenn. I want to thank Frank. I very much want to thank our panelists. Thank you also to the audience for the questions, for the engagement, for the listening, to asking questions. There's so many comments in the chat, and it was really gratifying just to see that, people commenting as the presenters were showing their work. At this moment, it has also been a long day for everyone who is part of the review process, who didn't just show up for the panel. They've been going for how many hours? Like 8, 9 hours.
Yeah.
And we get to the kind of the grand finale, the Reviewer's Choice Award, which I think, Glenn, you're going to walk us through. So thank you. This is my final words, but thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren, and the panelists, and Frank. You know, we could talk about this all day, and you know, as Evgeniy pointed out, you know, what can be done? You know, sometimes photographs just aren't enough, but as photographers, we need to do it. We need to do it, but somehow this war needs to end justly. Well, for those of you who have joined us later, I'd just like to say that this is the end of a day-long program. We've been having portfolio reviews, and now we're going to announce the winners of the Reviewer's Choice Award. Photographers in today's portfolio reviews were encouraged to submit their projects for consideration for this award, which was evaluated by a group of the reviewers. And we're awarding 2 winners. Each will receive $150, and their work will be featured on the SDN website. And the winners of the 2023 Reviewer's Choice Award are Eleanor Mosman for her project, Nzugum Lives Among Us. And in a second, I'll try to explain a bit more about what Nzugum means. And our second winner is Mohammed Hazian for his project, If They Move Me, I Die. So I'd first like to show Eleanor Mosman's project, but before I do, I'd like to invite Eleanor just to say a few words if you're here with us in the audience, Eleanor. And please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am. I'm Eleanor, and I just want to thank you on behalf of millions of Uyghur women for seeing them. This has been, it's the reason I put my pants on in the morning, really, and I've had to walk away from it in 2017 because it was becoming dangerous for people, for me being out there. And today provided a lot of resources and insight and direction and how to pick up this work and continue what needs to be done. I want to thank everybody at SDN for having a platform for this type of work. So thank you.
All right, great. I'm going to share Eleanor's project on the SDN platform. So let me share my screen now. And first, let me just read from her project description before I show the work. Pardon me, Eleanor, if I mispronounce some of these names. So the project is called Nzugum Lives Among Us. And in Xinjiang, an autonomous region in northwestern China, over 1 million ethnic Uyghurs have been apprehended by the government and now live behind the Black Gate. As Uyghurs disappear, the women outside these prison walls face systematic repression. Women are forced into marriage with Chinese men, not allowed to speak their native language, and sent across China to work in factories. The worst case scenario is their children being taken away and put into orphanages, human trafficking, and alleged organ harvesting. Uyghur heroines are nothing new, as a Uyghur allegory dating back to the 19th century about a woman from Kashgar, Nzugum. In this story, Nzugum kills an enemy outsider she's forced to marry, rather than yield her chastity and bear his children. The women of Xinjiang don't have blood on their hands, but instead fight against outsiders with resilience, bravery, and dedication to their families and country. So now let me share some of these images from her outstanding project. And if you'd like to read the captions for these images, they're on the Social Documentary Net website. You could just barely make out, but there's a newly married couple underneath that fabric there. All right, well, congratulations, Eleanor. And I'd now like to show Mohammed Hazian's project, but before I do, I'd like to invite him to say a few words. Mohammed is in Egypt, and it's well past midnight there. He said he would make it. I'm not going to hold it against him if he didn't, but Mohammed, are you here with us? Yeah, they're.
Thank you, Glenn, so much for that. So happy that to be one of the winners for this year and for this great platform. So, and I'm looking forward to more with that really.
All right, let me share his work and talk about his project briefly. Let's go share my screen again, right? And let me read his project description. The project is titled, "If They Move Me, I Die." This project sheds light on the human impact that accompanies processes of development and renovation in Greater Cairo. While parts of the city grow tall, in their shadows lie the imposed destruction of ancient neighborhoods. This story, depicted through the personal experience of Mohammed's grandmother, is emblematic of many others' experiences. She gives voice to those who were pushed aside. And now let me share this work. This is such a rich photo. There's so much in here. All right, well, congratulations, Mohammed. Congratulations, Eleanor. This brings our
Thank you.
very long day to a close. I want to thank everybody who's been in this panel, who's been with us throughout the day. Thank you for staying with us. May the war end in Ukraine soon, very soon. And just really want to thank everybody and just say goodbye. And, feel free to unmute yourself and just clap your hands and honor everybody who's been with us.
I would love to add something really that's very small thing that like I would love to thank Dr. Lauren Walsh for being that beside me from the beginning of this project. Really, she helped me a lot with that project and keep like open mind for me, very patient that to listen to me, to listen my thoughts. So I would love to thank her so much for that.
Thank you for adding that. I didn't know until this evening, actually, then Lauren had been working with Mohammed for many years. Lauren was not a juror in this, so it was not biased. Okay, and this will be posted to the SDN website in a few days to our YouTube channel. All right, so let me say goodbye and thank you to everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Frank, Glenn, I was just going to say a quick thanks to the two of you as well, and to all the SDN behind the scenes who were probably getting things, like doing things all day. So thank you.
Sure.
No, thank you. It was all good. It was all very, very good.
Yeah, I mean, once we start on a conversation like this, we realize we could just go on forever and just touch the tip of the iceberg today.
Yeah, it's yeah.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
See ya.